Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you. I have to admit that moving that TV was the scariest part of my day. I thought I was going to trip. I moved a heavy, I moved not a heavy object, but an awkward object into our basement yesterday. We had this large toy that we've had for a couple years for Leo that all of a sudden he's now into I'm afraid of shadows in the room. So he wanted this thing out of his room, and I'm just admitting to you something really dumb. I took it downstairs and I missed the second to last step, and I fell, but I didn't get hurt. It hurt a little bit, but I'm okay. So I was just having a little bit of a moment of am I going to trip backward and fall off the stage? Moving that. But it didn't happen, so it's all good. Hey, in the spirit of being lighthearted, I wanted to start off with something. I sent, there's a minister guy that posted a Twitter thread a couple months ago about how to avoid family and people according to Jesus. And I thought I'd share it with you, and a bit tongue-in-cheek because I've told you before I'm an introvert. So my favorite holiday is New Year's Eve because all of the stressors of trying to be perfectly attentive to family and friends are out the window on New Year's Eve. You can just sit back and chill out. And so anyway, this guy posted this, and I thought this was funny because one of the passages that he references is the one we're going to look at today. So I just thought I'd share. This is his quick tips from Jesus for dealing with family and friends. So number one, pretend that you don't know them. For instance, in the Gospel of Mark chapter 3, when Jesus' mother and brothers and sisters came looking for him, he asked, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" So that's a way to get out of it. Another one is hide and spend time with other people. In Luke chapter 2, which we're going to look at today, Jesus, when he was 12, decided to deviate from his family and go hang out with the religious leaders and ask them questions and learn. And his family weren't happy. We'll look at that one in a second. Arrive late, no matter the consequences. This one's just crazy that he referenced this, but in John 11, when Lazarus was sick, two sisters wanted Jesus to show up and do something about it, and he decided to come a little late. He still did something about it if you know the story, but anyway, I thought that was funny. Don't tell anyone where you're staying. In Mark 7, Jesus left Galilee and went north to the region of Tyre, and he didn't want anyone to know which house he was staying in. That's fun. When you need a break, this is good, say, "I'm going to go pray now." Always, look the part in the process. Jesus in Luke 5 often would, go off and pray by himself. And then he concludes, this is a good one, when all else fails, good meals heal. Jesus brought his disciples together after he was raised from the dead around a fire to have a little fish fry in the morning. Made things all better after they were a bit downtrodden. Anyway, I thought that was humorous. We're going to look at the story in Luke chapter 2 this morning of Jesus running away from his family and scaring the daylights out of them this morning. But to get our minds around that, I wanted to start off by asking, have you ever... Okay, I won't ask the question. I'll just say it this way. Lately, Angie and I have been watching interviews with comedy people that we like, and one particular came up with Conan O'Brien. You guys know who Conan is at all? He's kind of dumb, but we think he's funny. Anyway, Conan was being interviewed. Well, he was having a discussion on his podcast, and we were watching a video of his podcast. And someone had asked him, what got him into doing what he's doing. And He basically said that when he was in school, he just fell in love with the art form of comedy and decided to go that direction. He became a writer on The Simpsons and on Saturday Night Live, and then became a talk show host. But he talked about the fact that his parents had a completely different plan for what he was going to do. Like, his dad was in a different field, and that's kind of what they expected him to go after. And so, a bit tongue-in-cheek, he admitted that when he picked his line of work, he came back to his family and was like, yeah, I'm going to go this route. And he said it didn't go over all that well, because nobody wants their kid to come home and say, hey, I'm going to be a comedian. That's just not going to be the thing that your parents want you to do. Now, the reason I say that is because I had a somewhat similar experience. I know my parents are probably watching right now. If they're not watching right now, they'll watch later. And they're rolling their eyes right now because I've told this story before, but I haven't told it to you. But my dad was an electrician for Ford, worked there my entire life, had ups and downs when I was really, really little, overcame them, and ended up retiring there. And my dad is an excellent electrician, amongst other things that he's talented at, but my dad worked his backside. I mean, 7 days a week, 12 hours. I always would hear the stories of how early he was getting up in the morning, so if I ever griped about having to get up too early for school, he had a comeback. It was very valid because he was up at 3 in the morning to go do his job. But one of the things I always appreciated about my dad was my dad didn't want my brother and I to have to go that route. So we grew up hearing about you should go to college and you should get a 4-year degree and do something in a field that you'll do well in, but also might not have to make you go through the rigors that I had to go through. And so that was my parents' hope and dream, that my brother and I would go into a good field and get a good job and do all this different stuff. And then I ran into Jesus when I was in high school, and he ruined everything. Because by the time I started making decisions about where I was going to go to school, I started feeling that nudge toward going to Bible college. And my parents protested. Not in a mean way, but pretty heavy-handedly, because, when you want your kid to go into a good, producing well means kind of line of work, ministry ain't it. And the other aspect to this that I didn't know at the time, but later on in conversation, over the last, 6 to 8 years, my dad and I would meet weekly over lunch. And he finally told me one day, he's like, your mom and I never had a problem with you going. In fact, we know you went the right route. But he's like, I had a friend whose dad was a minister, and I saw all the harsh sides of it. And I didn't want that for my son. And as I've later told people, my parents and I were both right. I answered the right call, and I don't regret it. But they were also right about the hardships. But I definitely didn't go the route that they would have liked. In fact, the funny thing is my mom ended up doing a career shift when I was younger and became an IT consultant, computer whiz stuff. And my brother went into the exact same field as my mom. So I felt a little bit like the black sheep. And obviously, they do real, anyway, that's beside the point. Good field to go into, not trying to rethink my own. So anyway, the reason I tell you that is, I don't know about you, but maybe you've been in a situation, maybe it's where you're thinking about your career path, where you kind of deviated from the plan. Maybe you did something out of left field. Maybe it's not a career thing. Maybe you just bucked the trend in some other way in life. Everybody in your circle of friends were going one way and you went another, maybe on a decision that you had to make. Maybe it was a moral decision. Maybe you had to go against the grain a bit when it came to living a particular way that everybody else was going. I think on some level, all of us face these circumstances in life where we have to stop and we have to think and evaluate and say, which way am I going to go? And I think that's a good question to ask. Which way am I going to go? It's a great question to ask on January 1st. Because, hey, it's the new year. And as Jason said earlier, we're all making resolutions maybe. Maybe you don't do the resolution thing. But there's just something about the turnover of the calendar that makes you start thinking like, what do I want to do differently? What do I want to do better? What do I want to change? And so we're going to do this 2-week series called New, Growing Fresh Faith. And really the purpose of it's twofold. It's to get us in the mindset of thinking about what can and should and what we might desire to change. But it also is going to set up for where we're going for the year. Last summer, we started out a message series in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and we went all the way through to the Christmas story. And we're going to spend the bulk of the year focusing on what it means to be the church by doing a pretty in-depth study in the book of Acts. So I hope you're ready for a really in-depth study in the book of Acts, because I am, and you're forced to doing it. But we will take breaks along the way throughout the year and look at other books of the Bible and other themes and things like that. But to prepare us for this idea of thinking about what we should look like as a church, I wanted to bring it to the individual level. What does it look like to have a fresh perspective of living out our faith? And so for this little 2-week series, we're going to look at that first from the lens of Jesus, and then from the lens of ourselves in light of the teaching of Jesus. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that the same thing? Well, yeah, on one hand it is. But on the other hand, I want us to sit and reflect on Jesus making a decision that bucked the trend of what he maybe should have been doing, but that set the course of not only who he is and why he came, but how those events in his life unfolded. And it happened to be a rare moment in the Gospel of Luke where we get to see Jesus as a young boy. We all know we've got the birth story of Jesus. We just looked at that and celebrated that at Christmas time. And we know in the Gospel of Matthew, we get a little glimpse of Jesus probably around 2 years old and the whole flight out of Egypt sort of thing and the Magi coming and all that sort of stuff. Yes, the Magi did not come right when he was born. That might ruin your nativity sets, as I tried to do last week. It was more around the year, around 2 years old if you kind of look at things. But in the Gospel of Luke, we get a rare instance where we get to see Jesus at the age of 12. And 12 is a really interesting age because in Judaism at the time, the age of 13 was a really, really pivotal moment for a young boy. It's the point where they were to come into their own as a part of their religion. And at the age of 12, during the time of Passover, Jesus and his family went to visit Jerusalem. There were 3 holiday kind of marks where families that were in the vicinity of Jerusalem would go and make a pilgrimage to the area and participate in worship at the center of the Jewish faith at the time of Jesus. Now, in practice, not every family went on all 3 holidays, but Passover was the big one. It was the one everyone went to fulfill their religious obligation, and Jesus and his family went too. And Jesus, being a good boy, went with his parents at the age of 12. But as we're about to see in a moment, Jesus was a good boy and going with his parents, and he decides to, deviate from the plans a little bit and kind of get lost. But not get lost, because Jesus doesn't get lost, as we're about to find out. So I want you to read in Luke chapter 2, starting at verse 41, all the way to verse 52, at this little story of Jesus when he's 12 years old. And I want us to ponder it for a bit this morning. It says, "Now Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year for the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. But when the feast was over, as they were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but because they assumed that he was in their group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they began to look for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard Jesus were astonished at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were overwhelmed. His mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously." But he replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my father's house?" Yet his parents did not understand the remark he made to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with people. So this is, like I said, a rare glimpse into Jesus at 12 years old. His family are fulfilling their custom. They're traveling to Jerusalem to participate in Passover festivities. We know that there's a meal involved. In fact, there's going to be a Passover meal later in Jesus' life. It's going to become pretty integral to his ministry and the establishment of things that we still do today and will do today later on in the service. So he goes with his family, and they participate in worship and sacrifice and activities and meal. And it says that after the meal stuff concludes, his family goes back. Now, you may be wondering, how do Mary and Joseph lose Jesus? Well, if you caught on here, his family is going in a group. They probably have extended relatives, maybe even friends, other companions that have traveled in kind of a caravan sort of way. So it's easy to kind of just assume everybody's tagging along and kind of go on your way. And I always liked, did y'all see Home Alone at any point? Have you seen Home Alone? You know when Kevin's mom's like, "Kevin!" in the middle of the plane when they realize they've left him behind? That's what I imagine Mary is doing here. Like they're going along, they're a day away already, and they come to this horrible realization that their son is missing. And by the way, if you're wondering about the song, "Mary, did you know?" No, she did not. Here's further proof of it. Mary treasured these things in her heart, and she understood that God was doing something profound, but did she have the whole plan mapped out in her head? No. No, in her mind, Jesus is her son. And they're trying to be good, faithful, God-worshiping and God-fearing people. And they've brought their son along, and suddenly, when they zigged, he is zagged. And so they come to this realization. It says it takes them 3 days. If you're doing the math, it probably means that they realized after a day's journey they've lost him. Day 2, they concoct the plan, and day 3, they actually finally make it back to find him in the temple area. And that's where Jesus has gone. He's gone to talk to the religious leaders, the teachers. And if you hear this language and you're wondering, well, what did this look like? Does Jesus show up here and he's wowed everyone? He's a 12-year-old, but he gets it all? No. See, in the early church, believe it or not, one of the biggest heresies that the early church had to fight was not over Jesus' divinity. Even for heretical teaching, Jesus' divinity was not the problem. It was his humanity. And a lot of times we struggle with the notion of Jesus being fully human. But this is an instance of Jesus being fully human. He's a 12-year-old boy doing 12-year-old things, being curious, and going and learning. He's learning because he doesn't know it all yet. And yet, when you read this little section of Jesus at 12 years old, you find out that he's a pretty astute learner. Because according to the passage, all who witnessed Jesus in this moment recognized that he had something bright about him, not only in the questions he was asking, but when questions would come back to him, his answers were profound and astute. And the reason that we have this dialogue here is because the way that the teachers at the time would have taught is anybody in the temple, you would have the teacher there that would probably be in a seated posture, and those that were participating in this learning dialogue would be at the feet of the teachers. And it would be a back and forth. You know, if you come to church today, you're forced to sit in a room and listen to this guy get up and talk at you. I hope it's mildly entertaining and informative. But in the time of Jesus, the people sat at the feet of the teachers and there was a dialogue going. There was a question and answer dialogue. And not only did the learners ask questions of the teachers, but the teachers would use question asking as a means of teaching. Kind of like what do you think about this idea? Let's have a little exchange here. And so Jesus, at age 12, decided to go off from his parents as they were traveling back and go participate in this religious and faith education endeavor. And whatever it was, we're not told exactly what Jesus said or what he asked, but whatever he said and asked was very profound to all who found him in this moment. Now, this is my favorite part of the story, though. His parents come back on this third day, and they find him in this moment. And it says all that saw Jesus were astonished by his questions and answers. But his mom was a good mom. She doesn't come here and go, oh, this is all good. My son's really bright. No big deal. She goes to Jesus and says, hey, what were you doing? We were worried sick. Why did you do this to us? I mean, anybody that's ever had parents, you ever worried your parents sick before? Anybody? Raise a hand. Kids in the room, have you ever worried your parents sick before? Anybody? Yeah. I think we can all relate to this moment. Mary shows up with Joseph. She's like, your dad and I were worried sick about where you're at. It took us 3 days to get back here. I remember I got myself lost in a sports store once as a kid called All About Sports. I did not like getting lost from my parents, but I couldn't see them over the racks anymore, so I freaked out or whatever. And they found me in like 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. But we're talking 3 days here. And so they have this little exchange. And Jesus, though, his response isn't, sorry, Mom. It was basically, where did you think I was going to be? And I want you to catch something. Mary says, your father and I were worried. And just so you know, your father and I means Joseph and I. But Jesus says, don't you know that I had to be at my Father's house? Jesus' Father is God the Father, because he's the one and only begotten Son. And so he's participating in his family business. He's going to grow up, to get trained up, so he can do the work that he's going to one day do. And so he gives this response. But yet, after giving this response, which probably wouldn't go over well with any parent in the room, if their kid was like, hey, I'm where I'm supposed to be. It says that he went back with his parents and was obedient to them. And then we get that famous verse in chapter 2, verse 52, that says Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with people. And I love that because when you get into the Greek where it says increase, it doesn't mean that Jesus just grew up right then and there. The Greek implies that it's an ongoing thing. And again, I want to key in on Jesus' humanity. Jesus was fully human, which means he had to grow up. He was a kid. He had to grow up in size, but he also had to grow up in wisdom. And the way he did that was being obedient to his parents, which means his education continued. And by the way, in the home, in that culture, it was expected that parents would share their faith with their kids in their home. Yes, there were synagogues and places to do local worship, but the parents raised their kids in the faith. And so while Jesus deviated from the plan in this moment and went to the teachers, he went home with mom and dad, or earthly dad in this case, Joseph here, stepdad, and he learned from them and was obedient. And in doing so, he grows in wisdom and in stature. And not only does he grow in favor with God the Father, his heavenly Father, because he's the one and only begotten Son, but it says he grows up in favor with people also. So this moment where Jesus was in the temple, and it says people were awestruck by his questions and answers, that being awestruck with this kid as he's growing up continues. Why? Because he was obedient to his parents and growing in the faith, which in turn means he was obedient to God, because being obedient to parents is being obedient to God. There's rules about that in the Bible. You should read them sometime. So what do we make of this here? Well, as we reflect on where we're headed, not just as a church, but where we as individuals are headed, I wanted us to reflect on this story this morning, not because I want us to all liken ourselves to 12-year-old Jesus, because I know not all of us are kids in the room, although there are kids in the room, so I hope you hear this and do Jesus' example, except don't go off from your parents in this way. Jesus' response won't fly for you. I'm just warning you. But the thing I want to key in on that Jesus does is he deviates from the plan. Even though his most influential people in his life maybe didn't like his deviation. You know, as I reflect on the road that people travel and how it might differ from what's expected of them, all of us, as we go day to day, end up faced with many different decisions in life. And we have to decide, what are we going to do in these decision moments? Which way are we going to go? And sometimes those decisions lead us to deviate from the path expected. But if we really want to have a growing, fresh faith, not only in life, but it's January 1st as we're reflecting on what we want to be and become over the course of the new year, it's important that we take stock in what matters most. And not just in moments where we are faced with moral decisions between right or wrong, but sometimes we'll be faced with the decision between the good decision and the better one. And those, by the way, are the hardest decisions, which is why I brought up my circumstances that led me into going to Bible college. My parents had a good plan for me. In fact, in some regards, it was a better plan for me than the one that I chose by certain measures. But sometimes you have to choose the better route over the merely good route. Sometimes you have to say no to a good thing to choose the better thing. I don't know. I do a Bible reading plan every year. I encourage you, if you don't do one of those, you should do it. Read through the Bible, cover to cover this year. Do it. If you want to join me, I'm on that Bible app, YouVersion. You can find me on there, and you can do a plan, and we can see each other's progress and give little hearts to each other. It's super fun. But here's why I bring that up. I know reading the Bible, for instance, is really, really hard because it's a hard book to read. I've been studying it for a while, and it's supremely challenging to me still. That's never going to go away, just to warn you. But oftentimes there are other, even good things in life that get in the way of us having that little measure of devotion on a daily basis. You get into the hustle and bustle of the day. Your job, your workload's piling up. Your kids' schedules are too full. Your schedule is too full. And before you know it, you don't have enough time in the day to block out that time. But maybe if you want to grow fresh faith, it might mean saying no to something good in order to carve out time for the something better. Because if you want to grow in faith, in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and people, you have to choose the better route over the good one. The good route for Jesus would have been to go home with his parents. He chose the better route in the moment, even though it scared his parents to death. And he went home with them and was obedient afterward. But he did the thing he needed to do in order to grow in that moment. And this year, as you reflect, as maybe you know, I've told a couple people I've been making my, what did I do good at, what did I not do good at the last year list. If you're a reflecting person and you're doing that, even write out what are the things that were good that you could choose the better route as you go about this year. Now, one last thing. I've heard this a lot over the years. You might be saying, well, that's Jesus. Okay. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor, or with favor from God and people. But I'm not Jesus. I hear that a lot. I'm not Jesus. But the thing is, to be a disciple, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian, to be like Christ, means that we are called to go the way of Jesus. And that means that what was good and best for Jesus is also good and best for us. So as we look in these next 2 weeks and as we reflect for the year ahead and plot out the year ahead and figure out what we're going to do to change, the starting point isn't what Jesus tells us to do. That's the second part, which we'll look at next week. The starting point is what Jesus did. You guys ever remember those WWJD bracelets back in the day? What would Jesus do? I had a professor that always used to like to say, it's not what would Jesus do, it's what did Jesus do? Because it does us no good to pontificate about what Jesus would do in a given situation. What's important is that we recognize what Jesus did and model our lives after him. Jesus, even in this moment that probably isn't fitting for all of us, chose the better route over the good. As you plot ahead to what it means to have growing fresh faith this year, to be new, to be made new, and as you're figuring out what the year is going to look like and what you're going to change, I challenge you, as I will be challenging myself, to give up the good for the better so that we can become like Christ. And so as we start to look at what it's going to be the kind of church Jesus wants us to be, we will be equipped and moving toward doing and bringing our part as individuals to that plan. Now, as I said at the beginning, Jesus and his family went at Passover. And there's another Passover that is remarked upon in the Gospels that Jesus and his disciples participated in. And we know it as the Last Supper. Jesus gathered his disciples together to have a Passover meal. And at that meal, he did something new. He took out bread and he broke it. And he gave it to his disciples. And he said, to eat this is my body which is given for you. And he passed the cup. And he said, drink this is my blood which is poured out for you. And he did this because it was part of the new covenant. You see, we can talk about what Jesus did and what he calls us to do, but it's in this moment of celebrating what Jesus did that is the starting point for giving us the life and the power and the equipping to do as Jesus did and as he says. So when we take communion, it's not only the mark of the beginning of the end point of his earthly ministry, but it's a beginning point for us as we start to live lives of obedience to Jesus. So right now, I'm going to give us a moment to pause and to reflect, not only the year that is to come, but how we can be and grow more Christ-like, and to reflect on what it means to be obedient in this moment to Jesus' command to take and eat and to take and drink. And after that moment of reflection, I will invite you to take and eat and drink together as a church as we take communion together. I invite you to take this bread and eat. This is his body, which is given for us. And I invite you to take and drink of this cup. This is his blood, which is poured out for us. Please join me in prayer. Dear Lord God, I thank you for a new day and a new year. I thank you that while a new year is marked merely by the flipping over of a calendar and a couple numbers and a few letters, that a new day and a new year is much more significant because it's an opportunity for us to not only give thanks for what was and what we've had, and that we get to experience this new day and the start of a new year, but that it also gives us a moment to pause and reflect not only on the material change of life, but more importantly on what it means to be changed, to be made new in you, in a way that not only impacts our whole being, but impacts the world around us. And so God, I pray that on this first day of the new year, that you will help us collectively as a church and individually as members of this body of faith to help us to choose the right way to go, the better way to go. That in decisions both big and small, that we will choose to live lives of honor to you, and that we will grow in faith and spur one another on and to doing likewise. And I pray, God, that as we look ahead to this year, that we as a church will just do and be what you call us to do and be, and that it will have an impact for your kingdom in ways that we can't even imagine yet. And while that can be a very humbling and hard thing to imagine and reflect on, I pray, God, that you will help us to lean into you and your Spirit to do that, because we can't do it alone. And I pray, God, that you will help us to do it one moment and one day at a time, and to just have love and grace for one another as we help each other do this together. We pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.